She's a professor emerita of Africana Studies and Anthropology in the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies at the University of South Florida. She served for 12 years as the director of the USF Institute on Black Life, where she helped shape critical conversations around Black communities locally and globally. Her research and teaching have centered on ethnographic research methods, the intersection of race, gender, and class, low-income housing, histories of Black communities, Black women's community activism, and Afro-Cuban women's lives in Tampa. The class I took with her was called African American Community Research, and basically set me on the path of research that I'm still on today. She was a principal investigator on a National Science Foundation-funded project examining histories of racial violence in Florida, work that continues to inform how we understand memory, archives, and accountability. Her scholarships includes numerous articles in 2 edited volumes, including Transatlantic Feminism, Women and Gender Studies in Africa and the Diaspora, which she co-edited with some other folks, and then The Power and Freedom of Black Feminist and Womanist Pedagogy, co-edited with Gary Lemons. Dr. Rodriguez is a former Mellon Research Fellow and the 2022 recipient of the Ira Harrison Legacy Award from the Association of Black Anthropologists. We are very grateful for her scholarship, her mentorship, and her continued commitment to documenting and interpreting Black life in Tampa and beyond. Please join me in welcoming the Dr. Cheryl Rodriguez.
You are the best. Hello, everyone. Happy Black History, Black Emphasis Month. However, I celebrate Black emphasis, Black history all year round. And in fact, that has been my life, my profession, and I'm very, very proud of that. And I'm retired. But I'm retired from the University of South Florida, but after 33 years. But I am still doing the work. And once again, I'm really happy to be here this evening. I am also happy to see several of my students here. And it's really exciting to see people who were a part of my life at USF. Thank you, Ashley, so much. Thank you, Tomorrow. Tomorrow's one of my ex-students. Thanks, Hillary. So anyway, good evening. I am here to talk about the scrub. I only have 20 minutes to do this, so.
You got it.
But the point is that, there's no way to say everything that needs to be said in a short evening. So what I want us all to be committing ourselves to is to continue being enthusiastic and committed to learning about local history, because it is critically important. And that's one of the questions that I want to address this evening. Tampa really has a very rich history of Black achievement, Black creativity, Black leadership. A lot of us don't quite often realize that. And Tampa has received many people from the Black diaspora, including people from the Caribbean, Latin America, and the African continent. So all of those histories are brought to us to celebrate and honor and learn about. So I feel like I could teach a course on the Black experience in Tampa, and at the core of that course would be the scrub. So I want to talk about the importance of the scrub and why we should know about the history of Tampa's first Black settlement. And then secondly, I want to talk about what I'm doing to contribute to the life of the scrub story using histories, memories, and stories instead of just relating facts and figures. So let's begin with some poetry. There's poets in here tonight, right? I know Abney is, and others. So this is just a segment of a poem that always touches me when I talk about places. So this is SUNY Patterson, and this is a segment from the poem, We Know This Place. I swear we know this place, because we have vowed before never again to return. But here we are, back in the desert, dry mouthed and thirsting for waters from heaven. But come, children, rally round, and maybe together we can make a sound that will shake the trees or rattle the ground. Make strong our knees, we's a freedom bound. And we know this place, reclaim the crown. So this poem, the image behind us is an image of Central Avenue, but this poem was written in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. So it's about New Orleans, but there are images and feelings in this poem, and make sure you read the larger version of the poem, but there are images and feelings expressed in this poem that apply to many Black communities that have been ravaged and destroyed by the forces of nature, but mostly by the forces of human intervention. Somebody mentioned it tonight, such as the devastation of urban renewal, highway construction, demolition, displacement. So all of those forces have affected Black communities, historically Black communities, and have left us with so many questions and so many mysteries about communities that we have called our own. So the poet exclaims, we know this place. What do we know about this place called the Scrub? It was so heartening this evening to hear people say, I wanted to come in and learn more about the Scrub. There's no way for me to tell you so much about the Scrub. It was quite a place, but it had so many complicated stories involved. And I cannot, possibly get into those stories this evening, but I do want to give you basically the basic historical narrative about the Scrub. A few years ago, I made a video for the Tampa Bay History Center, and I basically wrote this historical narrative, and this just gives you just a small summary of the history of the Scrub. So for many years, the community known as the Scrub was the pulsing heart of Black life in Tampa. Settled in the post-Civil War era by freed Black people, the Scrub was home to Black folks from various southern states, as well as from the Bahamas and Cuba. In the Scrub, one could find a vibrant community of churches, schools, cultural societies, and even homes owned by Black residents. In the 1890s, Central Avenue, a historic entrepreneurial and entertainment area, was the Scrub's principal street of business. Known as the Black Downtown, which you mentioned this evening, at the turn of the century, Central Avenue was the site of nearly 80 stores, restaurants, insurance companies, newspapers, and other businesses that met the needs of African American residents. The Scrub community experienced tremendous growth in the first decades of the 20th century, and by 1927 was the most densely populated neighborhood in Tampa with over 8,000 residents. Many of these people were struggling with intractable poverty that kept them living in poorly constructed, low-income rental units. However, the residents of the Scrub were working people who raised families and built schools like the India Street School. Anybody remember that? The India Street School, Harlem Academy. Somebody said that to me this evening, the Harlem and Meacham School. There are about 7 churches founded in and around the Scrub community, including St. James Episcopal, Beulah Baptist, and St. Peter Claver. And St. Peter Claver is still right across the street from where the scrub was located. The scrub was congested, its streets were unpaved, and it was home to the poorest of the poor. But the establishment of many important institutions in the scrub community contributed to Black communal life and to a sense of hope and uplift for the Black community. In the 1940s, the scrub was demolished in order to build Central Park Village. I'm sure if you have lived in Tampa, you're familiar with Central Park Village, a public housing community. And then Central Park Village was leveled and Encore was built. And Encore is what is standing there now. So that is the basic historical narrative. But going back to my main point, my first point, why is knowledge of the scrub important? Why is it important? Well, first of all, very few people have actually written extensive histories of the scrub or other Black communities. So we still are yearning for sort of maybe a cohesive history or something that speaks to this history, because it comes to us in just bits and pieces. So it wasn't until the civil rights era and the student movement that led to the creation of Black studies that we actually began to find written histories of Black people in America. Written histories of Black communities were practically non-existent until, well into the 70s and 80s, and people are writing those now. So many of us who grew up in Black communities didn't learn to think of our communities as places of value. Think about that. If you grew up in a Black community, were you taught to celebrate that community? Were you taught to think about and learn about the history of that community? I grew up in a Black community. In fact, I grew up during the Jim Crow era. And we were not taught to think of where we lived as necessarily valuable. We weren't really conscious of that. So we didn't learn to think of our communities as places of value. We were taught that the places, spaces, and landscapes of our lives were marginal, dangerous, ugly, and poor. We were taught that our places, spaces, and landscapes had nothing to offer. Now, I say that, and it is true, but as I grew older and learned about, and I began to really think about the Scrub, Central Avenue, and other, what I call Black landscapes, other Black places, I began to really value my own community, the neighborhood that I grew up in. So I feel that Black community history matters. I want a shirt like that. Ursula, can you make one that says Black community history matters? I'll buy that and wear it. As Hillary said, during my 30 years as a professor of Africana Studies and Anthropology, one of the main courses that I taught to graduate students was a course on African American community history, community research. And I taught that not only because I wanted students to learn how to do research, but I also wanted them to learn that Black landscapes matter. I wanted them to really feel that they could do research in Black communities and bring questions and thought, and that was valuable. And I taught a range of students who all greatly appreciated that class. That was the only class of its kind that was taught at USF. So by Black landscapes, I mean, I'm talking about the physical space, but also the historical, emotional, political, and social connections to space that we have. So this concept of landscapes, this concept of landscapes in place it's powerful because for so long, denying access to Black people, denying access to certain places and spaces based on race was a way of maintaining a racial hierarchy. Think about that. It was a way of marginalizing Black people and making it seem that these places that we couldn't access were better. We couldn't go to these places because we were marginalized. We were marginal. So places like the Scrub and Central Avenue, Black landscapes were places of welcome, belonging, care, celebration, optimism, joy, and yes, even despair. But I think of these places as places whose histories we need to know. While the streets, buildings, porches, and other structures of this community are gone, the landscape still holds the history. And in Tampa, we're very fortunate because our landscape is very intentional. The history of our community, our Black community, has been honored and celebrated with various exhibits that are outdoors and easily accessible. How many people have seen this? Okay, yes, you have to visit this. It's very unique, very important, and it tells our history. Very, very, it's extremely touching to see this outdoor exhibit of Tampa's Black history. So another reason that we should learn about the Scrub and Central Avenue is that this community, this historic community, is a part of Tampa's history. It's not separate from Tampa's history, even though people who have written about Tampa don't necessarily include this history in there. I've studied all the writings of the people who have written about Tampa, and there's very, very little of us in those histories. So, but we still need to think of it as a part of Tampa's history, because it is. This is not a topic to talk about only during Black Emphasis Month. It should be a topic that stimulates other questions in our minds about how systemic poverty is perpetuated. Learning about the Scrub and Central Avenue and everything that's related to it should stimulate our thinking about housing inequality and the ways in which racial inequality is perpetuated through housing. So that is, so that's my thinking about why this history is important. The other point of my presentation is just to talk briefly about what I'm doing to contribute to this history and to contribute to a celebration of it and to make it more accessible. So I'm working on a book. I've been conducting the research on the Scrub and Central Avenue since the 1990s. And pulling everything together means learning a lot of different histories. Such questions like, what were local, state, and national forces that affected the growth and development of this area? Who were the people who came and went into the Scrub community? How was the Scrub community affected by the Great Migration? How did people from different countries interact with each other within this community? So I've had to learn about histories of land ownership, histories of institutions within the Scrub. I've had to learn about churches, schools, mutual aid organizations. I've had to learn about where people worked, familial connections, and many other aspects of daily life. in the scrub. Okay, so let's see. And this is a contemporary picture of the scrub. Many of you know about this. You just finished talking about you know where it is, okay? So, I look at all these histories and I try to write about the scrub in a way that shows its humanity. And so I want to close my comments. I want to close my presentation by reading a segment, and it's still a draft, but this is from chapter 1 of my book. And the chapter is called The Named and Unnamed, Arrivals in a New Village. Okay. In 1849, 15 enslaved black people traveled to Tampa from South Carolina with Reverend Leroy Leslie and his wife, Indiana Charles Livingston Leslie, and their 2 children. Traveling by horse and wagon, it was a brutal journey of weeks through the southern wilderness, especially for the enslaved men and women who were charged with the care of horses and humans. Born into a wealthy slaveholding family, Indiana Charles Livingston married Leroy Leslie in 1834 and presented him with a dowry that included several slave families. Perhaps some of the 15 enslaved black people traveling with the Leslies were a part of that dowry, but since their names were left out of the historical record, we may never know their ancestry. The Leslies were on their way to starting a new life in a new town. Reverend Leslie would become the first permanent minister to local white Methodists, and Mrs. Leslie would distinguish herself by noting the names of Tampa's white residents on a map that had been created by local surveyor John Jackson in 1847. Today, Jackson's map contributes to our understanding of Tampa's early landscape. Mrs. Leslie's notations on the map inform us of the names of early residents who committed themselves to building the town of Tampa, early white residents. But we know nothing about the 15 black people who were also adjusting to new surroundings, new people, and new responsibilities. White masters and their enslaved black properties arrived together in Tampa, but their experiences would be very different for centuries to come. Not long after their arrival in town, Jacob, one of the enslaved people whom the Leslies owned, passed away and was buried in the newly established Oak Lawn Cemetery. I gave him that name because I felt like he needed a name. Oak Lawn, Tampa's oldest burial ground, was established beyond the town's limit in the area we now know as the Scrub. This part of town may not have been called the Scrub at that time, but it was the outskirts of the village of Tampa. The cemetery was approved by the Hillsborough County Board of Commissioners for white and slave, rich and poor. Prior to the founding of this first public burial ground, villagers buried their dead in private plots. The creation of Oak Lawn Cemetery on April 1, 1850, predates Tampa's formal incorporation as a city. 5 years later, on September 17, 1855, residents would vote to adopt a city charter, elect a mayor, and have the corporation validated by the state legislature. But in 1850, there were only 79 dwellings in Tampa, and the town's population was 441. All indications were that the population would grow. Florida had been admitted to the Union in 1845 as the 27th state, and rich white men from Middle Florida were interested in the possibilities of Tampa. So, just as there was a need to accommodate new lives and new families, there was also a need to accommodate the inevitability of death in the small settlement. Jacob's death is noted in the history of Oak Lawn as the first known burial in that cemetery. His gravestone reads, A Negro slave, Leslie family, died 1850. We know nothing more about the unfortunate human who was owned by the Leslies and buried in Oak Lawn. What is clear, however, is that during the era of slavery, death brought no dignity to an unfree person, nor did it honor that person with the gift of a name on a headstone. Even if there are no answers, we should still ask, what were the names of the people who arrived with the Leslies? How many enslaved people lived, worked, and died in Tampa before the Civil War? Where did Black people live during this time in Tampa? How did enslaved and free Black people contribute to the history and early development of this city? This chapter tells the stories of some of the Black people who lived in early Tampa and their relationships to a wild and unfriendly landscape known as Tampa. This chapter is full of historical possibilities, unbridled speculation, fantastic conjecture, and unanswered questions. In my search for the light of truth, it is my imagination that brings our Black ancestors to life. Thank you.